Welcome to the Dashboard Effect Podcast. I'm Rick Thompson.
I'm Caleb Oakes.
Caleb, for today's episode, we wanted to talk about basically the difference between setting up data, loading data, and data modeling, and maybe even reporting. We definitely run into some confusion sometimes with our customers around how those are related to each other.
Yeah, right. I mean, understandably, right? This is complicated stuff, and to get really good reporting, you do need to break it down this way. It's going to help you a lot.
Yeah.
We did an episode a few months back where we kind of explained the three different, but just real quick at a high level, the way that we think about it after many years of doing this and finding that, you need to separate them into these three categories is you've got your data setup. That's kind of step number one, right? You're pulling data and you've got your raw data in a place that's very easily accessible and you can do some transformations on.
Yeah, and I would say you're not just pulling it once. So setup includes, at least for us, you're setting up a data pipeline that's going to run on a schedule to load data, in this case, into a data lake on some kind of regular basis.
Right. And ultimately, hopefully you're doing good delta loading, so you're only loading the changed and new records.
You're doing error checking.
So you got a lot to handle there. So it's like its own isolated thing.
Yes.
So that's what we call setup, data setup. Then there's modeling, which, let me say what the next one is because they're very closely tied together. And then there's reporting. So modeling and then reporting. So setup, modeling, reporting. Modeling, this is where sometimes people can get confused because the old way and the old data warehouse methodology was go figure out everything in the business and then come up with what the data model needs to look like. And then bada bing, bada boom, you've got everything you need to do reporting forever.
18 months later, maybe.
Yeah. And that just didn't work very well in the real world. So that like we're going to figure everything out and then come up with a data model just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Plain and simple, it doesn't work.
Yeah. I mean, all right. So let me qualify that. I mean, you can do that. The part that doesn't work is as you start building reports and using those reports, you're definitely going to be iterating the data model. And so to think you can build one time this huge canonical data model and it's going to serve the business for years onward, that's what doesn't work.
Yeah, it doesn't work. Right. Exactly. So anyway, the reason why we think of data modeling separately is because you almost need to do that. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. You don't need to do that every time you build a report. But for like a reporting area, you need to build a data model to support it. And even it can get even more than that. Like if you're building a sales report, the example I like to give is if you're building a sales report, you might think, okay, that's a simple data model. We can do that. But you need to know what the sales report's for, right? If you're trying to figure out if you're hitting your sales targets, that's one thing. But if you're trying to calculate salesperson commission, that can be a totally different thing. So you need to understand what you're trying to do. And that's why those two are so closely related.
The report and the modeling. Yeah.
Yeah. You need to know what you're trying to report on in order to build a good model to support it.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, I think that's good. No, that's a good explanation. And I think it's an important one because as people who are not doing this all day, every day, read about, say, a data lake house. A lake house, what makes it the house is that you've got this data model, this semantic model on top of the data in the data lake. And I think when you look at that diagram, maybe as a less technical person, you might think, okay, so as soon as we load the data, we're just going to build that semantic layer and we're done. Now, that semantic layer is kind of a living, breathing thing. You're probably not building a single canonical semantic layer, a data model to get at the data. You're probably, if you're smart, you're thinking about what are the uses of this data and building lots of semantic models to get at that. In the end, it may almost from the outside seem like, okay, there's one semantic layer, but it's probably got a bunch of different data models for the different areas of knowledge and facts that you're trying to get at.
Right. Yeah, it's a good distinction because, semantic layer, you're right. You might have multiple models within that layer. It's just a layer in your infrastructure, right? But I do also think that that's a really important thing that people, I would hope people start to understand is that the modeling is actually the hardest part like, and obviously there can be some exceptions to that, but in general, modeling is the hardest part because you're trying to make data that was not built for reporting on what you're reporting on generally,
Right.
be able to report on that. And it takes some real skill and some real know-how to structure that in a way that's going to work really well with your visualization tool so you can build the reports that you want to build. That is the biggest challenge most of the time.
It is, yeah. I mean, it takes skill, obviously, to do the visualizations and make them be intuitive and easy to use and so on. But you can't do that until you have the data model, and technically the data model is harder to build.
Yeah.
And yeah, there are cases where building the pipeline is just a nightmare because you're dealing with some crazy API and
Right.
various things. But then, then you really need to do the data model. You have to be both technically very proficient, and you've got to be able to understand business and the business rules that are going to drive the reporting. And you're right, I hadn't thought of it this way, but the reason you're building a Power BI report is likely because the source system, one reason is the source system is not giving you good reporting the way you need it, so you want it differently. More commonly, well, actually that's very common, but in addition to that, you want to bump that data from one source system up against data from another source system to get something that wasn't even conceived by the people that build those two source systems.
Right.
And so you have to figure out how to make those connect in a good way so that you get good logic and good reporting.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good example. Because during the data setup piece, now you've got it in the same location. So step one is ticked, right? Check that off the list. But now you need to make those two things talk together, and that's your modeling step. And that's where it's challenging. And the way that we do things now is like much like reporting, the modeling is also iterative. Like, how can we get something that's going to get us a step in the right direction? That also, you got to make sure that you're following good practices, which is why actually Kimball is still a really good model to follow in terms of how they set up their tables. Also works really well with Power BI, but it allows you to kind of do that incremental progress with the model.
Yeah, so you still follow a lot of those old rules around star schemas and dimensions and facts and so on, but you're not following the old 20-year ago idea of we're going to spend 18 months and build the final data model, and all reporting will happen off of that.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that just didn't work.
Yeah. Speaking of data models, the other thing that I wanted to cover in this episode is the question that comes up around, should we put all of our data into a single model, kind of what we were just talking about, which doesn't really work, or should we have separate models for every report? And the answer is that it's a balance. You don't want to have a separate model for every single report because inevitably you're going to have revenue in one report and revenue in another report.
Sure. And
they're coming off of different models. You need to keep those in sync somehow.
Right.
So I guess the bottom line is that you should be able to get a lot of your reporting out of a single model, but there are going to be, the way that I like to think about it in general is you've kind of got a main model. It kind of does most of your stuff, but then you're going to have little one-off scenarios that you need to solve for and problems that are coming up in the business you need to provide reports for. And those should be ancillary because if you try and pack all those requests into your main model, it's just going to become a cluster.
So you've sort of got specialty models that you use to solve specific problems. But like if you're building a model to do sales reporting, you're probably anticipating we're going to do all kinds of sales reporting out of this.
Yeah.
And as you point out, you don't necessarily want the extra work of building two models that are delivering the same data, plus the problem of just making sure you keep everything in sync between them.
Right.
So if you realize you had a mistake on a relationship or something, now you got to change it in two places.
Right. Yeah, you don't want to do that. Right. Exactly.
All right, good. Well, I wanted to talk about this just because I know that there's some confusion sometimes around what is the model, what is building a report, what is building a data pipeline. Data pipeline really exists in its own world. It's very much an engineering problem, figuring out how to make it work efficiently, accurately, fail gracefully, and be able to restart gracefully, all of that. And then separate is modeling and reporting, sort of sit in their own world. They're two separate things, but very closely related.
Yeah.
the reporting needs are going to drive the modeling largely.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
All right.
Cool.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yeah. Hey, anytime.
All right. Talk to you later.
See ya.